So with that, let me welcome you and thank you all for attending today's meeting of our Legislative Subcommittee of the SFO Roundtable. I appreciate you freeing up time to be with us today. And with that, let me call to order the May 25th, 2022 SFO Airport Community Roundtable Legislative Subcommittee at, what time is it here? 12:31, I think, 12:32, excuse me. We're meeting via teleconference, and joining us today are staff to the roundtable, and let me briefly introduce them. Angela Montiz, Roundtable Administrative Secretary, Jean Rendell, Technical Consultant with the Roundtable for HMMH. We also have from the county, we have Linda Wolin, Senior Legislative Aide to Supervisor Dave Pine, Lisa, I'm gonna butcher your last name, Ariel Sasa. As many times as I heard it, I still can't get it right, so my apologies. But Lisa's the Deputy Director of Planning and Building Department, County of San Mateo. And Bert from the SFO Aircraft Noise Office is with us as well. So let me thank all of you for being with us today. Angela, do we have anybody from the FAA on the line that we should recognize?
Thank you, Chairman. We do not have anybody from the FAA with us today.
Okay, they may be joining us, and if so, hopefully we'll recognize them at that time. But again, thank you all for being here today. At this point, Ms. Fontes will explain how the public can participate in today's meeting, and we'll open up for public comments for items not on the agenda. So Angela, we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Chair Royce. For those attending the meeting on the Zoom video conference, we will use the raise hand feature in order to organize any public comments. During the general public comment period and for each item on the regular agenda, I will ask those members of the public who wish to comment to click the raise hand feature to speak on that agenda item. For those joining by phone, please press *9.
We're going the front door.
Please press *9 to indicate your desire to speak, and you may then press *6 to unmute. When you hear your name called, I will prompt you to unmute your microphone and inform you that you may begin speaking. You will have 2 minutes. Please note that members of the public must wait for the prompt in connection with each agenda item before using the raise hand function. For example, you cannot raise your hand early in the meeting if you wish to speak later in the meeting. Any written comments that were submitted in advance will be acknowledged by staff during appropriate discussion item. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. And by the way, I should have noted that Brian Perkins from Congresswoman Spear's office is with us as well. So Brian, welcome. Appreciate seeing you. So with that, let's move on to the roll call. And Angela, could you please proceed with the roll call?
Thank you. Member Schneider is absent. And Member DiGiovanni?
Present.
Chairman Royce?
Present.
Thank
So
you.
with that, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Chair. You have quorum.
Okay, great. So let the record show we do have a quorum, and we'll move forward with the meeting. The first item on our agenda today is as normal, is we'll move on to public comment for items not on the agenda. Staff will read any written comments and allow members of the public to speak. So Angela, do we have any written comments for today's meeting?
Thank you, Chairman. We did not receive any written comments for items not on the agenda, and I do have one virtual hands raised for this item.
For the public comment?
Oh, never mind that the caller dropped off. I'm sorry, we lost them.
Okay. If there is no written comments, we'll move on to the oral comments from members of the public. So let me open that and ask if any members of the public would wish to address us on any items not on the agenda. Please indicate by raising your virtual hand and we'll recognize you.
Thank you, Chairman. And at the moment, I do not see any virtual hands raised.
Okay. Well, seeing none, I'll give it a minute here and I still don't see any. Seeing none, we'll move on to the setting the agenda. So we'll now entertain a motion to set the agenda and approve the consent agenda. And I would note the consent agenda includes item 2, which is a resolution for adopting the findings for remote meetings. With that, do I have a motion to on the agenda? Do I have any public comments on the agenda before I entertain a motion? Are there any hands raised for the agenda items?
Thank you, Chairman. I do see one hand raised.
Okay.
This actually may be Member Schneider. Give me 1 second.
Oh, great. Okay.
It's under Jacqueline Schneider.
Oh, it's me. Sorry.
Okay. Let me promote you to panelists. Just 1 second. So we can let the record reflect that member Ann Schneider did join our
Great.
legislative.
Great. Welcome, Ann. Appreciate you having you here. So we have all three members of the subcommittee on this call today. So thank you. So with that, there's no comments with respect to the setting the agenda or the consent items. Could I entertain a motion to set the agenda and approve consent items number 1 and number 2, which is a resolution to continue to meet virtually and to indicate that we met the criteria?
Motion for a motion. Oh, sorry.
That's okay. Go ahead, Ann.
Motion from Council Member Schneider and a second from Member
Yes, second,
Giovanni.
yes.
Okay, great.
Yes.
Okay,
Thank you.
could you
Ma'am.
just take a roll call vote on that, Angela, for the record?
Member Di Giovanni,
Yes,
Member Schneider,
Yes.
Chairman Royce.
Yes.
Thank you, Chair. Your motion passes.
And
Great.
to the
Okay.
chair, my apologies for being late. I had a constituent at the door.
You got to take care of that. So apologies accepted, but not needed, but thank you. For that, we'll move into the agenda. We really have about 4 things we want to talk about today. First and foremost, we wanted to get an update with respect to legislative happenings. And we have a guest speaker on that. We'll get to that in a minute. We also wanted to spend a little time discussing what might be coming down the track, a lot of which was discussed at the UC Davis Symposium on Aviation of a few weeks ago. So we wanted to sort of at least put that on the table for discussion. We wanted to follow back with Title 21. There were some comments from the last meeting with respect to that. So we wanted to go back with that as well. And then we sort of wanted to get an update on what we talked about at the last meeting, and particularly that aviation letter we sent. Those are sort of the things we want to talk about. At the end of our regularly scheduled items, there will be an opportunity for anybody to add anything to the agenda that's not being discussed if time allows. So there is that opportunity at the end. Before we started, I did want to just revisit a little bit what the purpose of this committee is. We've not met for quite a while. I think it was last September from the last meeting. And there is no charter per se for this committee, but the work plan and the work group has sort of listed what they thought the subcommittee's mission is. And it's really to research, analyze, and advise the roundtable on any existing and or pending federal legislation, and to advocate for adoption, modification, or denial of legislation through congressional offices and the FAA. So it's fairly broad, although it's focused primarily on federal matters. We had just talked about one time whether or not we should expand it to include local and state, but we have not yet moved forward on doing that if we wanted to. I think federalists kept us pretty much occupied. At our last meeting in September, we spent most of the time discussing the 8 bills that Congresswoman Spira put forth and the legislative process in Washington. We'd also discuss a bill, I think it was Congresswoman Meng that I proposed, discussing noise abatement and control within the EPA. I don't believe anything has moved forward on those bills, although there was this subcommittee of the Aviation Committee and the hearings they had about a month ago. But I don't think anything further has gone forward with those bills. I know Brian's on the line, and Brian, if you'd be willing to add some comments from your perspective on that, I'd appreciate it. So before we take public comment, Brian, would you add something to that?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I took the time to look for or to call the subcommittee staff about what their plans are with respect to the testimony that was taken in March. And what they will be doing is collecting all that testimony and using it in part to scope out what changes they may wish to embed within the forthcoming FAA reauthorization. That reauthorization occurs next year, before the end of next year. So starting in June, they think that they will be putting out a basically call for ideas from interested members about what needs to be changed with respect to FAA in general, one subject of which will be noise. And that would be a moment in which our office would be able to submit ideas to the subcommittee. And then the actual report won't be issued in all probability until the end of this calendar year. I should point out that depending upon the outcome of the election, the issue of noise may or may not be taken up next year. Even though the FAA reauthorization has to happen next year, it'll depend upon who the subcommittee chair is at that time. The Democratic side is definitely interested in aviation noise. Most recently, they even took up the issue of helicopter noise. The Republican ranking member on the subcommittee is apparently pretty convinced that noise is no longer an issue, or if it is, it's not an issue of legislative concern anymore. So I want to be fair to them. Maybe I'm over-characterizing what his sentiments were at that hearing. But if the Democrats have a subcommittee chair next year, then that chair will be very likely to at least consider if it some sort of legislation involving noise. One of the most likely things to happen is that they would require the FAA to actually create a new metric, because as we all know, the CNEL boundary, due to the neighborhood noise study, that was the boundary was revealed to be what we had long suspected, and that is a bogus metric. And so that's likely to be taken up, and it would be taken up in the way that Congress would require the FAA to develop a new metric. As we all can see from the existing lengthy study that occurred starting in the around 2015, it's a long process to do anything through the FAA. But that's one of the more likely things to have happen. But again, it depends upon who's in charge, and in this seat, who's the member of Congress and how much they can push through. But a reauthorization of the FAA is the magic moment. And so that's what this committee should be focused on for the rest of this year, is submitting their ideas to us, and then we will submit those as well as our own to the subcommittee, assuming that we get the call, which we hope to get at some point in June or soon thereafter.
Okay. When is the FAA authorization? Is there a deadline? Is there a specific date, or is that just during the next session?
Online, it said end of June, but the staff member said end of 2023, end of June 2023, but the staff member said end of the year 2023. So it'll be somewhere in that time period.
Okay. And there's a process, Brian, if I heard you correctly, that the comments should go through the congressional office rather than individually submitted?
Well, it's probably most effective to do it that way. You can always submit something directly to a subcommittee. But once we learn that there's actually a call for proposal in effect, then we'll let the roundtable know.
Okay. I appreciate that, Brian. You know, the irony from my perspective is it seems that Aviation Subcommittee, and I'd be interested in your comments since I know you participated or listened into it, seemed a little one-sided. So that's not necessarily hopeful. But Ann, did you have a comment?
My comment from listening is it seems, and maybe it's a universal problem, that people only want to talk about what's good and happy, and not what's real. So, and they tended to listen to the staff that presented, and staff also tends to want to present happy and not what's really happening. So I appreciate what District Director Perkins has said. You know, I'm not in the most hopeful place right now. I'm certainly showing signs of 2 years of COVID stress. And I recognize that. And the other part of me that says, you know, you got to keep fighting the fights because that's what we've got to do. And my question for Mr. Perkins is, one of the outcomes of COVID was the acknowledgement that when we got so quiet, when the world got quiet, people slept better. When they slept better, they're healthier. And what I'm finding right now in the environmental field is we silo ourselves. So I'll talk garbage, but garbage has a relationship to this and a relationship to that. And I just wonder if Congress has the ability to understand that noise has health impacts, and that might be the direction that we really need to take. And to me, that's the direct link to possibly a nighttime curfew.
Well, in answer to your question, Congress certainly understands it. As to whether or not enough members feel that to the extent that they would be willing to do anything about it, that's a separate issue. And so what I did is I asked the staff sort of the same thing you did. It didn't sound to me like there were a lot of members in that subcommittee hearing that were convinced that noise is a serious problem. And I basically made that statement. She said, oh, no, you didn't hear it correctly, because the Democratic side is definitely convinced that noise is a problem. And in fact, it's interesting, that particular staff member once had a position similar to my own, where she, in fact, dealt with, she worked for Eleanor Holmes Norton, who's a member from Washington, D.C. So she was taking calls from Washington, D.C. residents about Dulles and Reagan International. So she's heard this before. She was optimistic that something on noise could be done, but of course she doesn't vote. She's staff. And yeah, so health, yes, Congress will understand it. Whether or not enough people accept that it's an issue and want to do something about it, that's the whole problem of having to commit. That's the whole challenge, excuse me, of having to convince people to do something.
Thank you. Member Giovanni, did you have some comments or questions?
No, not at this time. Thank you, Chair.
Sure, thank you. Well,
And
I
thank you,
don't,
Mr. Perkins.
I'm sorry?
I wanted to thank Mr. Perkins.
Great, thank you. I would
Thank
echo
you.
that. Echo that.
Yeah.
I think the purpose of this opening session was just give an update on what we've talked about in the past. And critical of the past was the Aviation Subcommittee and the Congresswoman Spears bills, which are still there, but probably on hold, if I hear you correctly, Brian, until next summer when the FAA authorization comes before the table. What we might want to do here is give some thought over the next few months. Are there comments that we want to send through Brian, through the Congresswoman Spears office with respect to the FAA reauthorization? And that would probably boil around the letter we've already written, which I think was very concise and on point, but there may be some things that come out today that we want to supplement that letter with. So that might be the action item. So let's just give some thought to that as we go through the discussion today. With that, if Member Schneider and Member Giovanni have no further comments, I don't. Let's go to public comment on this item. Angela, do we have any hands raised for this?
Thank you, Chairman Royce. I do see 2 virtual hands raised for this item, and I will first call on Ms. Darlene Yapley. Give me 1 second to share my timer.
Okay. Darlene, welcome. Glad to see you here. So you have the floor.
Thank you, Director Perkins, for your update. It's much appreciated. I just wanted to clarify the timing for the possible proposal to the subcommittee. You mentioned that you might get a call in June. Is that early June or late June to give input to the reauthorization? I just am focused on that because Chair Royce mentioned, we could work on this for the next couple months, which is submitting a formal letter through the representative. But the question is, what is the timing that we will need to get that to you so that you can be effective? So I guess when does the date open up? And then how long does that last? If you could comment on that, just so we could be efficient, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Yapley. And I will then call on a caller ending in 342. So please accept this request, unmute your microphone and begin speaking.
Thank you. I'm the caller who dropped off a little while ago.
Oh,
Jennifer, for the comments not on the agenda, so I'm just going to combine my comments. My name is Jennifer Landesman, and I'm a resident of Palo Alto. And the reason that I had wanted to make a comment on that is not on the agenda has to do about the issue that the roundtable does not really engage the public. It reaches interested parties on your email list. And that is why over the several years that I've attended, the amount of public that attends is maybe 6 regular members of the public. But the real issue is what's happening with the NEPA procedures, that the public that stands affected by the actions that you discuss is not being reached. And I'll go ahead and mention that this may have an impact on how Congress also sees the problem. Because if the methods of engagement that the FAA and everyone has is limited to these meetings and limited to what's going on, and maybe this is what was mentioned earlier about being, insulated in these forums, and that the broader issues, the bigger picture, is not getting out because people just cannot access or even understand the aeronautical information that you provide, but which is not related to the real noise issues. So I think it just brings all the problems together. And I would encourage you to do some research about how you are reaching the public. Is it your responsibility to do so? What are the expectations? Because you may not even know what the FAA is expecting from you. And I think education around that would be helpful. Thank you so much for your time and the work you do.
Thank you, Jennifer. Appreciate it. We're going to come back and comment on these items to the extent we can, but are there any other public comments first?
Yes, I do see, oh, I already called on Miss Yapley, and then I do see a hand raised from Mary Lynn Bernald. So please accept this request, unmute your microphone and begin speaking.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank you for continuing to send the alerts to me. I am Mary Lynn Bernald, the former chair of the SCSC Roundtable. I also want to thank Mr. Perkins for the update. It's very helpful. I don't know what I'm going to request is possible, but I am requesting that you look into the records that should still be maintained on the SCSC Roundtable website and look for the letter that we wrote in response to the NES survey. It's a powerful letter. It speaks to what we felt were essential matters that needed to be addressed. And I would very much appreciate where you have not extended your membership to any of the former members of the SCSC Roundtable, that we could somehow continue to work in partnership and build a stronger collaboration. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Bernard. We will look for that. Are there other public comments?
Thank you, Chairman. We do not have any more hands raised from members of the public.
Okay, let's bring it back to the membership then and see if they have any comments or feedback on the comments raised by the public. The first one, if I could just take them in three orders. First one, Darlene had raised the issue, Brian, with respect to when it opens and when it closed for comments. Do you have any clarification on that, or can we find that?
Well, she just casually mentioned that she thought that the committee would be looking for comments starting in June. I didn't get the impression that there was a closing time, except of course Congress closes up after the first of the year. So I think it would be, once we get the request for proposals, we can start forwarding them, of course. People can start sending us ideas at any time and I'll keep a record of it.
Okay.
And so I think that should just be the way we do it.
Angela, if we can make a note, and Brian, so I guess what I'm hearing is you will start taking comments now, and we'll try to clarify if there's any deadline on submission of comments to make sure that if there is one, we will let people know. Is that a correct comment?
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, obviously the Congresswoman's own legislation, if it doesn't move, which it probably won't this year, to be honest, that will be top of mind for our office in terms of trying to get something changed through the FAA reauthorization.
Okay. So let's see if we can get something in writing on that, or something we can confirm. Jennifer, you had made a comment with respect to reaching out. That's probably broader than the subcommittee. That's probably a roundtable issue. And maybe it needs to be revisited. So Angela, I think what we need to do is make a note to the chairman that this may be a topic for further deliberations. It's come up before. I'm not sure we've done a lot with it, frankly, and we probably ought to give greater thought to it. I do know at some city councils, and I speak specifically in mine, the members do make a comment during their report on their activities, reminding people of what goes on with SFO and when the next meetings are, but I'm not sure that's a common practice. We may want to give some thought to having some sort of automatic communication to the city managers, but let's see if we can huddle on that and see how we can do a better job. I think the comments are well made. And I'll come back to this to each of the council members. And Mary Lynn, you had indicated a letter to NES. Do you know what year that was written? well, we'll go back and see if we can find it and review it and see if there are comments there that we ought to include as we move forward. But if you have that letter, if you could forward it on to us, that'd be great. Otherwise, we'll look for it. With that, let's go to the members. Ann, I see your hand is up. We'll call on you.
Thank you, Chair. Actually, Mary, now I'm getting very familiar. I can recognize Darlene and Jennifer's voices, but Mary Lynn Bernald, I don't recognize, and I didn't catch which roundtable you were from.
I think it was was it the Santa Clara one? Angela, could you open
She's the
phone
former
for Mary
chair
Lynn?
of the Santa Cruz, Santa Clara Roundtable.
Santa Cruz,
is
Santa
a
Clara. Okay.
Council member from, I forget which city in Santa Clara County.
So if Chair, with your pleasure, I think we would be happy to continue working with them. And again, what came up at all of these meetings are starting to run in at our work plan meeting, that at least on ground-based noise, we want to be as inclusive as possible. What I hope, and one of the reasons why I voted against expanding membership, is the concentration on arrivals, when a lot of the work that we're doing has to do with departures as well as ground-based and close-in operations. And in my 6 years on the roundtable, most of our time has been spent on next gen. Sometimes the bad things are what drive the agenda on that. But I am actively trying to find people around the country, if not the world, who are working on ground-based close-in communities. Our issues are different, but we also get all of the issues that we get flights flying over us from Oakland. We get everything, the close-in community. So it's not just one or the other on there. So I'm happy. I would love to keep hearing that. I just wasn't familiar. If that was a letter from like 3-4 years ago, just keep in mind that elected officials serve on a lot of committees, and helpful reminders are great.
Yeah.
And then in terms of Jennifer's comment, I come from an activist background. I was a former Sierra Club activist. One of the things I find amazing out of noise is how few other NGOs work on the issue. The environmental groups do not work on this issue. It's a very specialized area, which makes it harder to get people to speak up authoritatively, with confidence in their voice when they're speaking to electeds. So I hear what Jennifer said, and I will tell you, from my city, I have deliberately tried not to get people too upset because there's no solution. And then they'll just get as angry as so many people were the first 2 years I was on the roundtable, when NextGen had just rolled out, and we had people from all over Northern California attending, driving to Millbrae for those meetings. But I hear what you say, and we're starting a process in Millbrae to begin to bring residents up. And maybe that's what Congress needs to hear, is more of our residents saying, this is a real issue. This is affecting our health. It is affecting our sleep. It's affecting our children's ability to learn, especially when these planes are flying over or are nearby schools. And then this roundtable is choosing not to include air pollution, but these are realities. So I appreciate what Jennifer said. I know I'm working it in my own city as we try to bring our residents up, but in a way that doesn't set them into a constantly being angry over something when we have so little say in it. I hope that makes sense. I am angry. I don't sleep at night. If we could get a couple of little wins, then it's better for our public and they'll get more involved. And we haven't been able to get those wins, except maybe the procedure that we voted on at the full roundtable. So I'm sorry, I'm a little wordy today, but I hear you, Jennifer, and I agree.
Thank you. Thank you for the comments, Anna. I appreciate it. Member Giovanni, do you have any comments or questions based on the public comments you heard?
Pretty much. Thank you, Chair. Also on what you were saying about getting people involved, and Member Schneider, is that maybe also in the cities, maybe we could tell our roundtable members that we can start having them, maybe our cities can make sure that they post our regional meeting so that people know that they can go to our website and maybe gain access to this meeting as well, so they know that exists in the time. Even though some of us do report it at our city council reports, I think that there's always room to do better and expand more and make it more inclusive for everyone. So I think that individually, or at least express it, Chair, maybe to our fellow colleagues, that would be a good idea. And then get more input. I think that the power, and I don't want to use the words power to the people or whatever, but it will also help our Congresswoman and Mr. Perkins, I believe, the more people we have included.
Yep. I think you're spot on. I do think we need to maybe rely a lot more on some of the public comments. And if they're not being informed of what's going on and what the meetings are, that limits us. So with that, if there are no further comments from the council, from the membership, I want to thank the public for the comments. We will follow up on them. I'll report back at the next meeting, but I will raise it with appropriate parties. Let's move on to the next item, which is probably one of the key parts of the day's meeting. And that's item number 4, the noise legislative update. And we're pleased to have Emily with us. Emily is no stranger to our committee. She's been here many times. And she's going to give us a brief update of what's going on with legislation, what might be coming down the path. And if you have any suggestions for actions we should take based on what we hear, please keep that in mind, because we'd like very much to come up with some sort of action items out of it if appropriate. Although it may be a year from now before the timing might be better then. But at any rate, Emily, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's so wonderful to be with all of you today. And I do think that the Congresswoman's office covered quite a bit of sort of where we're at right now with legislation, with Brian. Sorry, I wanted to make sure I got your name right. With where we're at with the timing for FAA reauthorization, what the committee's focused on, things like that. I did want to highlight that the subcommittee hearing that was discussed, I did have the privilege of testifying at, which was very exciting. I think, what the staff on the committee, this was the first subcommittee hearing or first committee hearing on noise since 2007. And so that in and of itself, I think is a good sign. But with the timing of it and with legislation, we are winding down now to the end of Congress here. And with the election, not only an election year in general, but somewhat of a, not a foregone conclusion. It's going to be a very, contested election in terms of, close races and close, sort of the leadership, as Brian said, may switch. So I anticipate that, the August recess will be long and robust because folks want to go home and campaign. And then after a reconvening in September to get the budget done and other pieces done, they likely will go out, and Brian, please correct me if you think I'm wrong, for campaigning up until the November election. And I would anticipate that then likely a budget would be passed during lame duck. Now, Congress never ceases to surprise me, but that's sort of the trajectory that we see. I do think that a couple of key takeaways from just our organization's interaction with the subcommittee and at the hearing of itself is that there is certainly an awareness of noise being an issue, but it is so very compartmentalized in the sense that it's not a national issue. It's an issue of folks who are next to airports, but you all do have some very similar friends or colleague setups in the Washington, D.C. area. And I think also the Minneapolis area is also very engaged and active, and they likely or possibly could be facing some changes in the coming years. They did not have any next gen changes to date that have had any impact, but that is likely going to change quite soon. So just as our role as a national organization and with your membership, to, connect you to other folks who are facing these issues and talk about best practices. As these things come down the pike and as different scenarios play out or different interactions happen, that connection is always really great. Our next meeting, just as a side note, will be formally in November as a part of National League of Cities. We are working right now to have a webinar for Noise members in the interim on some updates and some tools that folks have been using, particularly at Washington National. So I do think that legislatively, we are looking at next year at this point, based on conversations that we've been having in Congress. The kind of two must-pass bills right now are the budget, and then there's a bill right now that some of you may be familiar with, but it is a competes bill. It's called USICA in the Senate, competes in the House. They are conferencing the two versions together, and that's basically a bill to kind of help the United States compete with China and with other countries on technology, on jobs, on things like that. So those are the two sort of considered, at least what we've heard, it must pass. So I think for noise legislation, looking to the next Congress, which, as Brian said, again, starts in January, is likely what, sort of the trajectory here. And that's, we'd love for things to move sooner, but the good thing is that it gives us time. And I'm just so happy to be here with you all and happy to be working with your folks and your staff behind the scenes too. We can certainly be of any and all assistance in putting together those recommendations as the subcommittee starts to consider the reauthorization, and also, be flagging things for you. The final thing I will say is, in terms of the conversation around health impacts, I do think that what we have seen both in legislation and then in sort of the regulatory bodies that are adjacent to Congress on this. So talking about ASCENT, the Center of Excellence that the FAA runs with the research bodies across the nation, the universities, the things like the Boston study, things like that. Health impacts certainly is a very strong way for Congress to insert itself both as and legislatively and as an oversight body on measuring and also addressing the health impacts of noise, because there is a lot of pieces to this with the CNEL, the DNL, nighttime flights, how we measure all of the studies that we're all tracking, and it is so complex and different at each airport, frankly, and kind of the impacts and what fixes could happen. But studying the health impacts is, I think, a very good tool for there to be legislation around. And so I do think that is something that this body should consider continuing to support, as you always have. And I will just close with saying that beyond the testimony at the subcommittee hearing, Noise also participated. Our president, Brad Pierce, did speak at the UC Davis Noise and Emissions Symposium earlier this month. I know Darlene was very engaged in that. She was on the planning committee. And so folks have been very familiar with this event, but Mr. Pierce did speak about kind of past legislation on health impacts. And we as an organization will be working with our members leading up to the FAA reauthorization to think about legislation that makes sense towards addressing that. So we welcome collaboration on that and any help we can provide. So that's my update for you all today. I'm so happy to be with you and look forward to our future opportunities to address this group, and happy to take any questions.
Great, thank you, Emily. Let's see if the other members have some questions before we go to the public comment. I have a couple, but let me first go to Council Member Giovanni. Do you have any questions or comments, Pam?
Thank you, Chair. I just want to say thank you for the update. At this time, I have no questions, and thank you through the chair.
Okay, thank you. Member Schneider?
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Tranter, is there a way we can use your newsletter or other tools to find out if there are other people working or interested on low frequency issues? Ground-based noise, low frequency backblast, whatever we want to call it.
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, I can put you in touch very quickly with some folks in the Midwest that have been grappling's the wrong word, but sort of negotiating, deciding how they're going to move forward with some of the ground-based impacts. It's correct me if I'm wrong, but there has been sort of a lull in 10 years ago. Ground-based noise, low frequency noise was sort of one of the top 3 issues, and when Next Gen came in, that sort of usurped that issue. Not that it's not there and not that it doesn't have impacts, but it has certainly, in my experience at least, not been on the tip of everyone's tongue. So yes, absolutely can. And I know that there are other communities who are focused on trying to figure out how to take past data that's been compiled and what they want to do in order to kind of move forward with addressing it, and whether or not it is not worthwhile to address, but whether or not there are other things that need to take higher priority. So I can make that connection with staff, and then they can get that to you.
That's lovely. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So Emily, thank you for the presentation. So if I hear you correctly, there's no current legislation that for this year that we ought to be advocating strongly for, or that we should be strongly opposing, that the efforts that we should be gearing towards would be for the next session starting in January, particularly around the FAA reauthorization. Is that a correct summary?
I think that's correct. I mean, I do think that there's certainly legislation that has been introduced, all of the legislation that was just talked about, that is certainly worth support. However, I do think, I agree with Brian that likely movement on that this year is slim, just because of the time frame we have left and the literal and figurative politics of Congress right now, in terms of what they need to get done. I will note though that under the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and maybe Brian said this before I got on, but there was quite a bit of funding in there for the FAA. And I think just to that point is, and a lot of that was for facilities and for actual hard infrastructure. But just watching that and looking at the budget process for the rest of this year is the one thing that will be that will move. But particular to noise legislation, I don't anticipate anything moving. And I think that kind of recalibrating and focusing on proposals and things that we can push in the it's going to be 118th Congress, I think, come January is going to have a lot more traction, because not much will move between now and then.
Okay. And I want to get back to a couple of comments you made on health, but I'm going to defer those comments to the next item on the agenda, which talks about health impacts, because I think you made some very interesting comments that we need to explore further. With respect to the FAA, what's going on with our nighttime abatement process? I know we've quote unquote have gotten approval for the hours that we would have our curfew, but where does that stand? Do you know offhand?
I don't, particular to SFO. I don't know that. I can work with staff and with Doreen to answer that question, but I'm sort of focused on the, for lack of a non-pun term, 30,000 foot view, and how kind of the Congress and regulations impact you all. But certainly had a call with Angela and Doreen last week, 2 weeks ago, and we will be continuing to stay in very close contact on a monthly basis, so that I'm up to speed on everything and how that all interplays. Okay.
I think that's one of the quote unquote bigger wins we've had in the last few years. And I'd want to make sure that remains a win and doesn't get lost. And if there's something we ought to be doing from the advocacy perspective on that, we need to be aware of that. So,
All right, I will cover off on that for you.
okay, Angela, we can make a note. We ought to follow up on that. And you had a follow-up comment?
Yeah, sorry, I forgot about this one. So last week we had the work plan meeting, and what will come to the roundtable is a request. If you can't get things done at the national level, California has been known to be a leader on environmental issues. And for us, that means Title 21 issues. Emily, do you and noise, and the problem with Title 21 is it uses the FAA CNEL standards, which then are used in California. So when you're a community like mine that isn't impacted, well, most airports, they're not just the airport, it's the freeways leading into the airports. And then if it's a really well-designed airport, it's got a train running in and out of it. So you've got all these multiple transportation nodes, all impacting noise, and each one gets to ignore. I'm sure staff will say, well, not really, but from my perspective, each one gets to ignore the noise that they create and blame it on ambient noise, which then again makes those communities that have all those transportation nodes even more impacted. Long way of getting to saying, I want to dive into Title 21 to see if California can break away from the FAA standards because they are not reflective of reality. I'm wondering if noise or any other states are looking at the world that way, or if they have the same situation that their state agency is using the FAA as the measurement.
Yeah, I mean, I think that every state is using the FAA as the measurement. I think that just looking at through the lens of aviation noise impact, that California is probably the most progressive in terms of having the CNEL, but in terms of other sort of impacts and ways that folks measure and ways that folks mitigate, that we're always going to fall on the FAA standards. I think it would take a national effort. I'm not saying that it's not worthwhile, and it's something that noise is certainly in support of, but sort of a longer national effort. And to your point earlier, before I spoke about the nighttime issue and the health impact, all of that is sort of, I think a domino is going to have to fall. And I think particularly likely with the health and with studies of health impacts that would then need to create a different national standard, because I think having state to state standards with how big our nation is and how intertwined our airspace is would be difficult. But I do think a different national standard is certainly on people's minds.
Thank you. Al, what that makes me think of is, and I don't know which of our committees, possibly technical working group, we should be envisioning what that standard should be, and because we need that to advocate for that. So rather than say, hey, FAA, go work on a new standard, what are the standards we want? What do we want included in there? And I'm sorry, we had a very long council meeting last night. The loss of children in Texas, I'm just not at my highest today. But that's exciting. Thank you, Emily. I agree with you. I work in the solid waste industry. Thankfully, in my field, it is state and local driven, and we only go to Subtitle D for stuff for the feds, and we've worked around them and we're successful. So I think our time is to start working around the FAA.
Okay. I see. Let's go to the public for comments now, if no other committee member has a comment. And I see, Brian, you have your hand raised, so let's call on you first, if you don't mind.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. What Member Snyder was just talking about, in effect, is what Congresswoman Spears' HR 4926, the Leave Act, is all about. We have been advised that California does not get to go its own way on noise, and that's why she introduced the bill that would allow California and other states, if they wish, to have individual noise standards by airport based upon science and based upon standards similar to what California has been doing for generations based upon air quality. And so, at least from our research, we don't believe that California gets at the moment the authority to set standards for noise independently of the federal government. And that's why the legislation was introduced. If someone believes otherwise and they're able to defend that in federal court successfully, then more power to them. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. Are there other public comments? Angela, do we have any other hands raised on this topic?
I'm sorry, really quickly, Brian, that was HR 4926.
Brian?
Yes, I'm sorry, HR 4929. Excuse me, HR 4926, the Leave Act.
The leave. Okay,
4926. Okay, I'm glad you asked because I had written it down wrong myself. Okay,
thank you.
okay. Other public comments
Thank you,
on this-
Chairman.
on this item?
Thank you, Chairman. Well, I do see Member DiGiovanni's hand raised, and I do
Oh.
have 2 members of the public hand raised.
Okay, let's go to Member Giovanni before we go to the public. So Pam, you have a comment?
Would you rather the public go first? Mine is real quick. Actually, it was Mr. Perkins that answered the question, and I was going to refer to that part of the legislation, not quite in depth and eloquently as he put it, but that it does limit us in that capacity. But we can maybe there's other things to work around. But yeah, given that it's FAA and federal. But anyway, thank you, Mr. Perkins, as well.
Great.
And thank you, Chair and Member Schneider.
Thank you. Okay, with that, let's go to the public comment then. You 2 hands raised. So Angela, if you could
Thank you,
recognize and
Chairman.
unmute.
I will first call on Mary Jo Fremont, followed by Darlene Yapley. Ms. Fremont, please accept this request, unmute your microphone and begin speaking.
Mary Jo Fremont, Palo Alto. It would be great to supplement the high-level update provided today by Ms. Trencher with some information on past legislation introduced to reduce noise over residential communities. Following Brian Perkins' comment on HR 4926, it would be important to know in particular noise's position on legislation that was introduced by Congresswoman Spear, such as allowing airports to put in place curfews or having a community technical representative fully participate in the FAA design process for procedures that affect their communities. So what is noise position on each airplane noise bill introduced by Congresswoman Spear? This legislative committee should be interested in noise answers given their interest in legislation. So again, where does noise stand on each aircraft noise bill introduced by Congresswoman Spear? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Fremont. And Darlene? We can unmute you and recognize you.
Hi, Emily. You mentioned in your statement about the funding of the FAA study on noise metrics for the reauthorization of 2018. And as you know, the section 173 and 188 that was done on alternative metrics, the Quiet Skies Caucus letter to the FAA included signatures from Rep. Spear and Rep. Eshoo that the report was wholly inadequate, failing to meet the mandate in the law, and to return to the drawing board. The FAA has not redone the report. So I think my bigger question, because we're talking about studies and the upcoming reauthorization, is how can the FAA be more accountable to legislative mandates if we in fact do carry on with more studies and have them not be addressed? So that's number one. And the second is that there's a lot of money that gets put in the reauthorization bill that isn't necessarily noise legislation. And one of the useful things has been money for studies for procedure design. Many of the roundtables, including this one, are constrained because there's so many needs, arrivals, departures, ground-based noise, that how can we get funds for these types of procedure design that is funded in the reauthorization so that there can be more consultants that can be funded to come up with alternatives for departures, arrivals, and make more money available for ground-based noise through the membership fees, et cetera. So it's not a bill to change a metric, to change this, that. It's really about provisioning these roundtables so that they can have more funds, more resources. And that question is probably to Brian and to Emily. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Darlene. Are there other public comments before we bring it back to the council, to the membership?
Thank you, Chairman. We do not have any more hands raised from the public.
Okay, let's bring it back and feedback on the comments raised by the public. Brian,
I'm sorry, Chair.
Yes.
I'm sorry, we did get one last minute hand raise, and I believe this
Oh.
is Ms. Jennifer Landesman.
Oh, great.
Give
Let's
me
take that. Let's take that first. Thank you, Angela.
1 second. Thank you so much. Ms. Landesman, please accept this request, unmute your microphone and begin speaking.
Hi, thank you for all the comments. It was really interesting to hear, and especially about the efforts at the state level. A lot of these issues regarding metrics are related to what kind of disclosures are available to the public. So I'm kind of threading that back to my first comment. And when you do research, if and when you do research about who the roundtables are able to do outreach for and whose responsibility it is to do what, FAA, airports, or roundtables, I would encourage the last comments that that Darlene made about funding, that it's a comprehensive look in terms of the funding needs to get things done. So it's not just fly past design, but you know how the process works. And I would just encourage that before there is funding assigned to very parts, that the overall process be looked at as supposed to work, whose responsibility it is to do what, and so forth. My understanding is that it should be the federal government's responsibility to address noise. The select committee had both Santa Clara, San Mateo, and Santa Cruz counties vote that the recommendations to reduce noise should come from the FAA and not the other way around. I'll follow up a little bit more with all of that sort of stuff that was processed then, and I don't think much would, you know, if anybody would be asked, I don't think that opinion would change that much now, but I would just encourage listening to, reviewing everything before all of this. So it's a lot of interesting paths, and thank you again. That's it.
Thank you. Angela, any other public comments?
Thank you, Chairman. We do not have any more hands raised.
Okay, let me bring it back to the committee. If anybody wishes to comment on the comments made, Emily or Brian, if you have any comments, feel free to weigh in. I see no hands.
Mr.
Yes, Brian. Yes, please.
Hi, Chair Royce. I'm sorry, there was one that was at the end directed to me, and I was reading something at the moment that comment was made, so I missed it. Could someone clarify what I was supposed to ask? And I'd be happy to try to address it. My apologies.
I think one of the questions dealt with how can we make the FAA more responsive to the public. And I do know Congressman Spirit introduced a bill with that regard a couple of years ago. It's one of her 8 bills. I think that was the gist of the question. Darlene had raised that. And the secondly, the use of the money in the reauthorization, a lot of it can go from matters none related to noise, but relates to process procedural matters. And how can we provide some input on that with respect to allocating it to some of the issues that we're dealing with around process?
You know, let me deal with the second one first, and that is that I'm not technically prepared today to address how much of the money, if any, in the infrastructure bill is available for noise. I know that some of it is. Given that noise is not a high priority for the FAA, although they would argue otherwise, I would expect that some of the money, but not much. But beyond that, I'm sorry, I can't offer a more substantive answer. With respect to how to make the FAA more responsive, the FAA is responsive to the degree that Congress forces the FAA to be responsive. And of course, they're public servants, so they want to be responsive on the terms that are set forth for them and their mission. One of the points that was made by my predecessor, Kathleen Wentworth, is that their mission is flawed. And so if you change the mission to include noise and you make noise at least as important as efficiency within the airspace, the FAA will be more responsive to noise as an issue. And that, of course, was another bill that Congresswoman Spear introduced. So let's credit the FAA in one respect. They did respond to one of the recommendations of the various committees, and they did allow for a night hush southbound departure to be established. It just got established, of course, just a few days ago. Took a number of years. And they are responding to some extent. Again, if the Congress requires them to come up with a new noise standard, they will be that responsive. But this is a question about accountability through Congress and to some extent through the executive branch, because the civil servants in the FAA have ongoing duties, and they're not going to be diverted from those ongoing duties unless they're both told to be diverted and also given a budget to deal with that issue. And I guess that's about the best that I can say with respect to making them responsive.
Thank you, Brian. Emily, did you have anything to add to that, or?
I would just say I think Brian's absolutely right. There definitely has to be a budget and direction. However, I do think that comparatively speaking, with the wonderful advocacy on behalf of that the communities have engaged with, this roundtable and others across the nation, the FAA has done some shifting in their response, because they have to, right? Because there's a groundswell of concern and of advocacy around it. I just think it is a very, very complex, very long, has a very long runway. Again, sorry for the puns, in terms of making these changes. And I do, noise does absolutely support funding for support around communities for consultants on new procedures. And I will send out in the update that we provided for this body, we did provide a link to the health impact studies past legislation. So that's there as well. And I know that can certainly be shared, or I'm happy to send directly if someone wants to reach out.
Thank you, Emily. Member Schneider, you have your hand raised.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the speakers. I think Brian might have addressed it. Darlene talked about the funding, how funding works within the FAA. I'm just thinking for our work plan, if there's something in that we start getting ready for, working obviously with the Congresswoman's staff, that we could be pushing during that reauthorized plan. But we've got some time to work on it, even though we meet infrequently. But I need more time to think about what Darlene said about trying to get more money to work on real issues that impact at the local level. So if we're comparing SFO, where we've now learned that our hills actually concentrate noise, versus an airport like Denver, which is out on the plains, they may have a different set of circumstances. I don't know what they are, but I'd like to dive into what Darlene said whenever we can, so that we can be ready for that FAA authorization.
Okay, we'll make a note of that as we move forward on this. But good point. I have no further comments on this. So with that, we'll conclude item number 4. And Emily, I want to thank you for your presentation on that. I do think there's a number of follow-up items, and I know staff has made a note of them, and I have as well. So we'll have some tasks to follow up on. With respect to item number 5, this was put on the agenda to sort of get us thinking about what might be coming down the road, and what future legislative needs or responses may be needed, or where we need to start thinking about a position we need to take. And some of this stemmed out of the UC Davis Aviation Symposium of a few weeks ago. There are 4 categories that we just wanted to at least put on the table, because they will likely be, they're either a current topic or there will be a topic in the near future. 1 was health impacts of noise. 2 was the alternative noise metrics and where they stand. 3 would be the air taxis and urban air mobility. And 4, sort of an update on the status of supersonics. And both Gene Rendell and Tim Middleton from HMMH will be leading a quick discussion, sort of framing the issue on 3 of them. The first one on health, our guest person unfortunately can't make it, but I just wanted to tee it up because we talked a little bit about it. And what I came away from that symposium with was some clear points that maybe we haven't focused on emphasizing the health impacts of noise as much as we should, nor have we effectively given a lot of thought on reaching out for collaborative efforts with nonprofits or health organizations. And I made like 6 quick notes that just broad topics. And I just want to list the notes and then we can give some thought what we ought to be doing with it. One was a comment, noise needs to be viewed as more than a nuisance. And to some extent, that's how we view it, but it clearly has a major impact on mental health and physical health. So, and there's a lot of details at the symposium that would support that, and some studies that would support it. I also made a note that aircraft noise, at least by one of the speakers based on the study given, makes a comment that it is the most health-threatening source of noise pollution. With all the noise going on, that comment sort of resonated with me that aircraft noise seems to be the #1 most health-threatening item. 3, that the existing noise limits in discussions tend to underestimate the effects of noise. And some of the studies would support that. This was one, and the Swedish study, the doctor from Sweden made a comment that the noise was higher at takeoff than landings. And that needs to be better understood. The 5th thing was nothing new, but there are new studies that are regarding the impact of noise on people, particularly around cardiovascular disease, diabetes, lung disease, mental disease, stroke, and hypertension. And in Sweden, they use that as a format for increasing the hours of night curfew. That became the impetus for some of the laws they passed. I've seen some of the studies with CVD and stroke, but I guess I hadn't really focused on the quantifying the impact on health that some of these studies had seemed to do. And so the comment is, are we using that sufficiently? And then the other comment I noted, which resonates with elected officials, is the cost, the health cost of noise. That the impact of noise on the cost to a community or a region or a state is vastly understated and much greater than is being noted. And so if I look at those 6 comments, I guess the question is, are we effectively using the health impact of noise with respect to lobbying on getting better limits put in place? And what should we be doing around that? So that was this item #1. We're going to come back and discuss all 4 of these at the end. So let me go to item #2, if you don't mind, and then we'll come back to all 4 at one time. And Jean, I think you're going to cover item #2, which was the alternate noise metrics. What's the latest update on that? Jean, are you there? There you are.
Yes, I'm trying to unmute. Give me just a second here. And I actually have a short presentation because I think it's beneficial just to understand what these metrics are. So I will be sharing my screen. Please confirm that you can see it, Al.
Yep, we can see it. I can see it.
Okay, so I just want to quickly go through alternative noise metrics and actually it's just all noise metrics, just so that people are aware of what is it we're talking about when we're talking about noise metrics. So I'll be talking about A and C weighted levels, maximum sound levels, sound exposure level. So all those things, and I'll just go through them one by one so that it's clear. The human auditory system is not equally sensitive to all frequencies. That's why we have the frequency weightings that we do. And the A-weighted is the one that human response is closest to at noises that we hear in our everyday lives, what we hear outdoors, things like that. It's not to hear levels louder than that, because there are different weightings to use when you're like in a rock concert or something like that. And so the EPA has actually adopted, as well as the FAA, the A-weighted sound level for environmental analysis. There's A, B, C, D, and there's even an E weighting. The 2 that are most talked about are the A and C weighting. The purpose of talking about C weighting is that it doesn't discount, if you will, the lower frequency noise. Because as sounds get louder, say like in a rock concert or something like that, as the sounds get louder, your ears become more sensitive to the lower frequency noises. Therefore, you're perceiving them as being louder than you would when you're in normal environmental sounds. And so that's the C weighting just represents how the human ear responds to noise levels when they're much higher than what we typically are subjected to in our everyday lives. That's the difference between A and C weighting and how the human ear responds to those different frequencies at different sound levels. So next, the first one is the easiest one, maximum sound level, also denoted as Lmax. It's basically during a noise event, an aircraft goes over, it comes at its highest sound level, and that's the maximum sound level. So it only accounts for sound amplitude. There's nothing about duration in there. And I'll get into duration a little bit later when I talk about sound exposure level, which is a way to describe both the sound amplitude and the event duration, or the full noisiness, if you will, of a sound. And California Title 21 actually defines the single event noise exposure level, which is essentially the same as SEL. Okay, SEL and SENEL are essentially the same, except for SEL requires a predetermined threshold noise level, and that the energy above that level is what contributes to SENEL, whereas SEL doesn't have that preset prescribed threshold. Essentially, they're the same metric. So here is just a little diagram showing two aircraft flybys. One was higher in noise level, but lower in duration. And then if you put those two into SENEL, which is basically condensing all that energy into 1 second to normalize it, you see that actually the one with the lower noise level of 74 Lmax had a higher SENEL. And generally people say that that one did sound noisier because it lasted longer, even though the maximum level might have been a little bit less. And then that goes into the community noise equivalent level in California. And so the community noise equivalent level adds up all those SENELs for every hour. And so then you get an hourly noise level. And then you add up all the hourly noise levels to come up with your 24-hour metric known as the community noise equivalent level. And it also puts in weightings for both the evening hours and the nighttime hours. They're about a 5 dB addition. It's actually 4.7 dB for evening sounds and a 10 dB for nighttime sounds. And the purpose of that is that people do actually, in surveys, have said that evening and nighttime noise they find more annoying or more intrusive. And they also find them as being noisier, even though they're the same level. And that's because some of the ambient noises are lower during these times of day and during the night when we're trying to sleep. Next is the equivalent sound level, looking at that sound exposure level again coming in, that same event. What it does is if you take that event over that duration that's shown there, you get an equivalent sound level. In this case, it's 76 dB. So the Lmax was about 81 or 82 there, but the energy equivalent level is 76. And what all that is that if you took all that energy during that 1 minute and you had a steady state noise rather than a rise in level and a fall in level, if you had a steady state noise, it would be equal to 76 dB to produce the same energy as that non-steady state noise. Next is the number of above. This is probably less known to people. It's been something that actually I think Australia was one of the first to start looking at the number of events above a certain noise level to try to assess people's annoyance to noise and to better understand noise in certain communities. And so it's pretty simple metric to kind of determine if you look at the graph there. So we see that there were in this 1 hour time slot, there was one event that generated noise above 80 dB. So N80 would be 1. And then we see that there are 3 events in that hour that generated noise above 70. Therefore, the N70 is 3 and the N60 there is 6, meaning that there were 6 noise events in that hour that was higher than 60 decibels. So when you hear the number above noise metric, often denoted NA, but then it actually goes to like N level, meaning how many noise events exceeded that level. That's what that is. And then there's the time above. Time above is the amount of time the level is above a threshold sound level. So if you set the level, say you want to know 60 dB, how much time above 60 dB, or how much time was that noise above 60 dB? In this case, it's 38 seconds of that minute. This accounts only for duration and no magnitude. So like maximum sound level accounts for only the how loud it was. This accounts for only how long did it last. And so those are the metrics that are out there currently. Some summary remarks I want to make is CNEL continues to be a good indicator of annoyance and assessment of land use. And that's one thing that I think I'll talk a little bit more about when I talk about Title 21 in the next topic or item number 6 in this. But really, one of the things we need to think about in future legislation, in my opinion, is that are we really talking about land use anymore? Because that's what Part 150 and Title 21 both address, is land use. And when the FAA sees jurisdictions putting non-compatible land use within the 65, they have to be scratching their head. It's like, wait a minute, we're all saying that this is not compatible, yet the jurisdictions are still putting incompatible land uses. So are we really wanting them to move the land use compatibility threshold further out? Or do we want them to address what you're talking about as the health effects and the other things that can provide annoyance? Or are we really saying, no, we want to not have these land uses near airports? So something to think about when we're talking about future legislation and moving that 65 CNEL to something else. Anyway, something to start thinking about. And A-weighted noise levels reflect how the human ear perceives noise levels in our typical outdoor environments. And other noise metrics other than CNEL for land use, as I already said, start thinking about these other metrics, not in terms of land use, but maybe in terms of health effects, maybe in terms of just overall annoyance. And then what can we do about those things? Because these other metrics are extremely useful in describing the noise environment people experience. So I will stop sharing now, and that's the thought on noise metrics. And again, it's just a point that I think it's useful for everyone to kind of be level set and understand the metrics that are being talked about and being used out there.
Thank you, Gene. We're going to come back and discuss this further. You've already alluded to one of the items is what does this mean to us and what should we be doing with it? So
Right.
I appreciate that. Let's move to the next item. I just want to tee it up again because it will be an area of future concern. And it actually sort of startled me when I heard the presentations and the symposium, and that's air taxi and urban mobility. And Tim Middleton is here. Tim, I think I saw you there.
Yes. Hi, Al. How are you? Can you hear
I'm
me?
fine, thank you. Yeah, we can
let
hear you
me
fine. Thank you.
Put my, where'd my camera go? There we go. Okay. I will be quick and be cognizant of time, and I can share the presentation with everyone after because there's a good amount of text in this as well. So, I'm going to talk about air taxis or UAM or advanced air mobility. Here's kind of an outline of my presentation, and you can see the graphic of some of the potential aircraft that are being developed and are in various stages of development currently. So urban air mobility is a concept transportation mode that's being designed initially for intercity transport, as you can see in the graphic there. And the concept uses new technology for electric vehicles using electric battery technology. And it uses vertical takeoff and landing, and you'll hear the term VTOL or eVTOL, which is electric vertical takeoff and landing. And initially, UAM or air taxis were proposed probably about 10 or so years ago, maybe a little bit longer, for dealing with congestion in urban spaces. So like the Bay Area, like San Francisco to Oakland, San Francisco to San Jose, things like that, or like the Chicago area, other urban areas. Advanced air mobility is also a term that's been coined by NASA. That's more of an umbrella term that incorporates the concepts of urban air mobility along with regional air mobility. And these vehicles are proposed to use what they're calling vertiports, which would basically be landing and takeoff sites that are separate from existing heliports and separate from existing airfields, but they might be designed and built near existing infrastructure. And there's some examples of some of the regional air mobility aircraft. As you see, X-Wing is actually a retrofitted Pilatus aircraft that uses all electric motors as opposed to the turbine-powered turboprops that the standard Pilatus uses. the mature state of AAM is not there yet, and there's a lot of technical, regulatory, and financial pieces that are in the process of falling into place. And you probably hear the term, follow the money. There's a lot of money being spent by global corporations on developing these aircraft. It's no longer, most industry players say it's no longer a niche market. It probably will happen, especially because you have the likes of Boeing and Airbus and airlines like United supporting financially the development of these aircraft. So part of that is that UAM and RAM, regional air mobility, have some similarities to existing infrastructure. And one of the things that they'll be doing is they'll actually be operating at, they're looking to operate some of these aircraft at smaller airfields that might not have the support of air service now. So the idea is that the cost to entry to air travel and air service will lower for everyone because of the underutilized public airports and the cheaper cost of flights using more sustainable, reusable, electric infrastructure. But to that end, there's infrastructure challenges. And there's proposals. You can see some of those proposals. Skyports is a global company that's proposing to develop their version of these vertiports. Urban Airport is another one. Years ago, Uber, which now Uber Air turned into Joby Aviation. Uber had multiple presentations showing how they were looking to retrofit parking structures or existing structures. But there's a lot of issues with that. It's not just flipping a switch. You have to understand that the aircraft can actually land and take off on those structures. Are they structurally capable of handling the aircraft? There's charging infrastructure you have to look at, emergency responses. Much like how an airport has airport rescue and firefighting, you need to have responses available for accidents and things like that. And airspace integration is another thing. Just because there's concepts of flying aircraft doesn't mean that they can just go into airspace however they want to, because they still have to work within existing infrastructure. So I'm going to talk some about the existing guidance, and then I'm going to get to some of the proposed legislation. So, and again, I will share the full text of this presentation, everyone. The FAA has issued interim vertiport design guidance, which is separate from the existing heliport guidance. So the FAA has heliport guidance, and then the state of California actually has in their state transportation plan guidance on vertiports. So you have to look at federal law, but legislation or federal guidance, and then also state legislation. But the interim guidance for vertiports is actually giving more space for what's called the FATO, the flight approach and takeoff zone, due to some of their safety. I'm not entirely sure if it's safety concerns, but they're basically enhancing safety to make sure that the FAA's goal is to make sure that there's safe and efficient airspace. So in terms of safety, they're making sure that this vertiport guidance is taking into account all the different proposed types of aircraft that could be considered eVTOLs. And again, as I showed, I think there's over 700 concepts for these eVTOLs, and then there's a different ranking of how far along they are. Just because someone has a PowerPoint presentation that says there's some graphics here doesn't really mean they have a flying version yet. Some of the manufacturers only have scale models, and then some of the manufacturers actually have full flying, one-to-one demonstrate flyers and things like that. But there's limited space for vertiports, right? So if the concept for urban air mobility or air taxi is that you're in the air to reduce trip times, you actually have to be able to, get to the aircraft and then fly in the aircraft, get to your destination, et cetera. So the farther that vertiports are sited away from city centers, you actually reduce the benefit of them, right? So you can see here, San Francisco Financial District, Lower Manhattan, New York City, right? There's not a lot of actual physical real estate to put vertiports, right? Without doing a lot of high-end engineering to figure out how you can actually put them on So that's part of why the concept has kind of expanded out to the advanced air mobility and regional air mobility, partly so that all the money that's getting invested to fly these aircraft, they're actually going to fly and operate in different regions. Then you have to look at airspace integration. As you know, the Bay Area has very complicated airspace as well. And this is just a look at like the New York airspace of existing aircraft, right? So then if you have hundreds of new vertical and takeoff and landing aircraft, how are they going to integrate, right? And so that's something that the FAA is looking at, NASA is looking at, and others are looking at. So there's, along with that, there's certification challenges. And the FAA, in terms of how pilots are being certified, because as you know, pilots have to be certified to fly. So there's different levels of flight training for commercial jets, and then you get type certificate training for each type of aircraft you fly. There's they're now looking to change the certification for pilots to make sure that pilots that are going to be operating these aircraft have what's called powered lift certification, because powered lift is is vertical takeoff and landing. So how you see like a traditional helicopter takeoff, these aircraft, and you can kind of see from on the bottom, the white aircraft there, that's the Joby aircraft. They have what's called tilt rotors, and you might be familiar with like the Bell Osprey, the V-22, the Marines fly it, where it has two big rotors like this, and it'll fly like that, but then it lands and takes off like that. And so the tilt rotors are more for efficiency, so they can land and take off in a smaller area, but then they can tilt the aircraft, tilt the rotors and fly more efficiently with them forward and backward. So the FAA has now said that for pilots to fly these aircraft, there's going to be a higher burden of training, which is probably a good thing in terms of safety. Additionally, in terms of how to actually certify these aircraft, the FAA has approaching it in two different ways. Depending on the aircraft, they're either certifying it or looking to certify it using, there's the two different CFRs here for either normal category airplanes or special type of aircraft. And that really has to do more with how the aircraft is built and how it flies, because some of the concepts use more of a traditional fixed wing with fixed rotors, and then it has a vertical rotor. So it would take a vertical rotor going up and then it uses it. Others use the tilt rotors and things like that. So there's multiple concepts to that. So again, cognizant of time, in terms of legislation, both the House and the Senate have issued similar type legislation as they typically do, and there's a little bit of different language in these two proposed laws. But essentially, both the houses of Congress are saying that to look to coordinate advanced air mobility into Department of Transportation and the FAA's existing infrastructure system, and how these aircraft will relate to the infrastructure. So these are out of committee and they're being debated as of, I think they were out of committee in the fall, and they've kind of been stalled based off of different legislation that's going on right now.
And pardon me, Mr. Middleton, through the chair, I just did want to note that it is 2 p.m. and I would like to ask Chairman Royce how he would like to proceed with the rest of the meeting. Sorry, Tim, to interrupt you.
Oh, no problem.
Yes, I'm sorry. I was misunderstood. I thought we had to 2:30. I apologize. I'm going to defer items on the supersonics update in Title 21 for the next meeting. Tim, if you could wrap this up, maybe we could take a quick discussion, public comment, and then adjourn the meeting.
Okay, well, I have more, but yeah. So there is some laws.
2 minutes.
Okay,
quick summary.
I'll go quick. I'll keep going quick, and I'll send this to everyone in the group. The Infrastructure Jobs Act that was passed has language in there about urban air mobility and advanced air mobility, so that's already getting pushed forward. There's multiple proposed legislation that's been put through the House to how to address this. The GAO issued a report in 2022 about the types of aircraft, how they can integrate into the system, and how public acceptance needs to be looked at. Because the aircraft, the selling point for the manufacturers is that these aircraft are much quieter. And you'll see press releases from the likes of Joby that just released work. They've been working with NASA, and NASA is looking to record these aircraft and get noise readings for them. So overhead flight is, they say, about 45 dB at 1,600 feet. And there are recordings of the Joby aircraft, and compared to other aircraft, and I think I can get it quick, hopefully, it is very quiet. So I don't know if you can hear that or not, if I'm sharing the audio, but I can send this. They are quieter. The issue is that, as we know from aircraft, existing aircraft, just because aircraft get quieter doesn't mean people won't be bothered or annoyed or disturbed by them. So that's something that we're looking at. In terms of implementation, there's this website that looks at the reality of when they'll come into service, and most of them are looking to enter service later in this decade. So the earliest service entry right now is potentially 2024, but most of them are looking at 2025 or 2026. And to be fair, about 2 years ago, a lot of them said they were going to enter service in 2023. So it's kind of like it's 3 years out, and then when it gets to 2 years out, it gets pushed to another 3 years. So they are getting close. And then at the end of the presentation, I have all the different references and things like that. So sorry for going quick, but I know we are cognizant of time.
Thank you, Tim. I appreciate it, and I apologize for the timing. I'm sure we're going to be coming back to this issue.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Al.
Gina, if you don't mind, we'll defer the Title 21 and the supersonic update to the next meeting. I don't think there's a immediate urgency around the two topics. If there is, we can always call a special meeting if needed. I wanted to get back to the three items we did discuss, though. I just wanted to bring them to your attention because they will require, there will be matters for future legislative and advocacy needs, I think. And those are three key ones here. Let me take it to the members and take any public comment on it. I am cognizant of time, and we'll try to keep it short. Ann, you have a comment?
I just want to say thank you. I didn't go to the symposium, but thank you for that. And one of my takeaways is I will add health to ground-based noise. And to Mr. Middleton, you know, it all sounds very cool and everything, but my community already gets every kind of air flight, plus trains, plus this, plus that. How can I protect my residents? And is there legislation that we need to do? We don't own the airspace, just like we don't own mineral rights, but it looks to me like we need a discussion of ownership of airspace, or any of us will be inundated by people who have a lot of money who can pay the taxi fare on that. I think it's cool on one side, and I think it's absolutely horrible. I already get helicopters over my house, maybe 20 a day. And we don't talk about that at the round table. I just think this makes the 21st century sound like hell. And it's not one incident, it's all the cumulative incidents, the never getting any peace. And I know this is the latest dot boom. They're all so enthused with each other, and they are giving absolutely no care to the little people. That's how I feel. Thank you.
Thank you, Ann. Pam, did you have any comments or questions? We might have lost her. And again, I apologize for running late. Let me take it to the public for public comment on these three items. Do we have any public comment on these three items?
Thank you, Chairman. I do see one hand raised from Ms. Mary Jo Fremont, and I will first call her. And I do see Member DiGiovanni still on the line, but she may not have any input.
Okay, we'll come back to her later. Okay.
Ms. Fremont, please accept this request.
Mary Jo Fremont, Palo Alto. I want to touch upon Jean's comment that the DNL 65 dB is a land use metrics. Yes, that's what is in the legislation, and that's why we had, as residents not represented on this roundtable, had made it very clear for years that you need to decouple the land use to the noise impact on communities, because the 65 dB DNL is what drives the noise insulation program. That's what drives Part 150. So of course, you're not going to noise insulate yourself out of these next gen impacts. So what I would have liked to see if I had been on this roundtable is to see a proposal from HMMH about what would be good metrics to measure the noise impact and what would be this threshold. That's really the question on the table. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Fremont. Other public comments?
And I do not see any more hand raised from members of the public, but I do see now member Di Giovanni has her hand raised.
Okay, let's move it back to the members. Member Giovanni, if you have any comments or questions?
Oh, yeah, thank you. I apologize for the technical difficulties, but I have to agree with, we need to be proactive on the legislation of these air taxis and start thinking out of the box, because this is a big equity issue. And everybody wants to say equity, but it definitely is not anything close to equity in any of that. I must say it's big money pushing into our communities, and we need to. I appreciate Chair maybe pushing it forward and bringing it back for us to discuss and getting more details. And maybe we can be very proactive on this and get feedback from our membership.
Great. Thank you, Pam.
Thank
With
you.
that, let me just make a quick comment, and then, and again, I apologize for the
Oh, no.
time pressures for today. That was my fault. I had the wrong timing down. Inexcusable. I wanted to raise these 3 issues plus supersonics, which we'll talk about the next time, because I think they are the next round of issues that the roundtable may be dealing with. They don't necessarily appear to be noise metrics, at least the one on air taxis. The other 3 clearly do, but they are going to pose a whole set of issues for our communities and our member agencies, whether they're public safety, whether it's view restrictions, whether who owns and who operates these heliports for all these air taxis, et cetera. And we need to start giving some thought to that, because what struck me was how soon they seem to be coming. I sort of looked at this as a little futuristic, and when I heard that LA at least was commercial use planned for 2024, that sort of put a warning bell in my mind. So we're going to give some more thought to this going forward. If anybody, including members of the public, have any thoughts on any of these items and you care to share them with us in an email, we'd appreciate it as we sort of explore it. But I at least wanted to tee these up for us to become aware of what might be coming down the pike. With respect to health, I would indicate that I think one of the action items this committee ought to consider is not just building more awareness of the health impacts of noise, but reaching out for collaborative efforts. I know the American Heart Association is all over CVD, and I served on that national board for well over a decade and served the chair. I can count on one hand the number of times we talked about the noise impacts on CVD and stroke. And that's something that they need to have a higher awareness of, and maybe we can collaborate with them. Same with some of these other American Diabetes Association, a lot of other agencies. We need to broaden the pool of people, bringing more awareness, no impacts of noise. So I think that's something we ought to outreach. And Angela, we can make a note. Maybe we can follow up on that. But again, if you have any thoughts, please let us know. We'd appreciate your input. Jean, on your error metrics, I thought that was informative. Some of the alternates, I think the comment raised that maybe we ought to get some recommendations, specific recommendations with respect to what we ought to be using, and some support around that. I think we may want to give some thought to that. And I think you sort of teed it up with your comments around land use and how that might impact. So with that, before I adjourn, we need to go to public comment on any final items, I believe. Is that right? No, I don't think so. I don't think there's a public comment at the end. Ann, you had a comment. I'm sorry. You're muted. Can we unmute Ann?
Sorry.
There we go.
I know Mr. Middleton said he would share his slides. Jean, those were great slides. I'm so tired today. I'm having a hard time. I think that's why we don't get public participation. It's tough to grasp the stuff. But the slides were excellent. Please share them. And Chair, this was great today. It's perfectly okay going over. This is tough stuff. And thank you for bringing it to our attention.
Thank you. It's tough to get all this in an hour and a half, but at least we got it teed up and we can make a report to the full roundtable, and maybe from there we'll get some further action. With that, I'd like to thank you all again for participating today. If you could please share with us some topics for future meetings. We only have one more legislative meeting scheduled for this year. Awful lot to get in, but we'll try to want to focus on what of interest to the roundtable and where we can take some action, where we need to be alert to. With that, we'll adjourn. I want to adjourn today in recognition and I hate to say the memory, but of what went on in Texas yesterday. A tragic event for the state, for the country, for all of us. And I want to adjourn with respect to those 19 kids and 2 adults to date that appear to have lost their life. So with that, we stand adjourned. Thank you.